This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Jacinta Thompson. I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Tonight we have the great pleasure of presenting Emeritus Professor Iain McCalman as he discusses his new book on the life of John Busst, Melbourne bohemian artist, who became one of Australia's most influential conservationists. And I wish to extend a warm welcome to Professor Iain McCalman, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's wonderful to have you here. After Iain's presentation, he will be in conversation with UniSA's Standing Acting Vice-Chancellor, Distinguished Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington AO. So thank you, Marnie, for your time tonight as well. Professor Iain McCalman is a highly respected and award-winning Emeritus Professor of History and the Humanities at the University of Sydney and the Australian National University. He has published numerous books, including The Reef, A Passionate History, From Captain Cook to Climate Change. He is the former founder and co-director of the Sydney Environment Institute. Please join me in welcoming Professor McCalman. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for coming. Cold out there, and I'm very touched that you have come. And thank you for your kind words. I'm just going to give you a little summary, I guess, of the book, so that we can then get into the meat of it when we discuss. And I've called it John Busst, The Making of a Nature Warrior. Late in 1929, Horatio and Dolly Busst, the proud and wealthy Bendigo Catholic parents of John, aged 20, and Phyllis, aged 28, received a terrible shock when their two previously conscientious children suddenly dropped out of Melbourne University. Phyllis, considerably senior to her brother, was on the brink of completing her medical degree, and John had just switched from law to undertake a journalist degree and been offered a part-time cadetship with the Argus newspaper. Why, then, when neither had any prior skill in painting, did they suddenly ditch their degrees to join the Meldrumites, a band of notorious bohemian artists? The answer was that Phyllis Busst had fallen under the spell of a charismatic young artist named Colin Colohan, he'd offered her a tantalising model by having earlier abandoned his own medical degree to become a leading and wealthy exponent of the tonal art system developed by Max Meldrum, a radical Scot. Max's distinctive system of painting suited beginners like the Busts because it was based on the democratic principle that anyone could be an artist, provided they learnt to capture the way that images strike the human eye. Colohan, too, was the leader of the bohemian Meldrumites who prized themselves on practicing a radically alternative way of life, and one that they also regarded as an art form in itself. By 1929, Phyllis had become one of Colohan's several mistresses, and she persuaded John to reject his dull university career and join her in acquiring her lover's lucrative art skills and daring sexual behaviours. But on the 3rd of November 1930, Colohan woke up to learn of the brutal overnight murder of Molly Dean, another young mistress. Realising that his curt treatment of her had forced her to walk home late at night via Melbourne's back streets and into the clutches of her killer, he felt deeply ashamed. So he decided as a result to move to Europe. And in 1932, he persuaded his pupils, John and Phyllis, to transfer their painting lessons to his friend Justus Jorgensen's new Queen Street art school. In practice, John was attracted less by Jorgensen's paintings than by his ambition to build a medieval-style artist colony in rural Eltham. Over the next 8 years, John became one of the leading creators of what is now the famed art centre of Montsalvat in Victoria. He learned how to build in Pisé and adobe, to work with timber, stone, metal and glass, and to foster and to protect wild environments. Then, in 1936, Jorgensen, who was ever on the lookout for money, nagged John to reconnect with his wealthy, alienated father. However, this reconciliation led Horatio to restore both of his children's cancelled inheritances, which later gave them enough money to break free from Jorgensen's bossy grasp. In 1940, they thus moved to Queensland to help establish an entirely new tropical artist school on the remote Badara Island within the vast lagoon of the Great Barrier Reef. Here, John leased a few acres of land on which he built a beautiful adobe homestead overlooking Hernandia Bay with its white sand beaches, dense rainforest, and its own fringing coral reef. And now, settled at last, he was excited in 1945 to meet Len Webb, an intense young forester scientist engaged in collecting medicinal plants for the CSIRO. This encounter soon blossomed into a lifelong friendship, and Len taught John how to cherish both the scientific and the aesthetic properties of his tropical surrounds. In return, John taught Len a passion for drinking rum and listening to romantic poetry and wild music. A year later, John invited his longtime school and university friends, Harry and Zara Holt, to enjoy a honeymoon holiday on the Busst Island homestead. Harry, then a senior figure in the federal Liberal government, and Zara, a successful Melbourne dressmaker, were so smitten with Badara's exotic tropical flora and fauna that they became regular visitors thereafter. Every year they visited the Bussts for 20 years. Adventurous Harry would develop into a passionate coral reef skin diver, and flamboyant Zara would eventually persuade her husband to buy a holiday house and rainforest only a few miles from the Bussts. Yet Phyllis Busst was moving in an exactly opposite direction. Having urban tastes, she was suffering from the island's isolation, and especially from John's increasing preoccupations with environment. So she persuaded him in 1948 to sell up some land to enable her to return to an independent life in Eltham. Deprived of his longtime companion and sister, John grew so lonely that the Holts decided in 1950 to cheer him up by organising an exhibition of his art in Melbourne. This proved only moderately successful, but had the happy result of introducing him to Alison Shaw Fitchett, a simpatico woman from the Western District who shared his age, his tropical tastes, and his wicked sense of humour. They were married in Cairns on the 8th of July 1950 and settled quickly into a comfortable, companionate relationship. Well, John and Ali, as she liked to call herself, their decision in 1957 to purchase rainforest and moved to Bingil Bay on the mainland was driven by Badara Island's increasing invasions of nosy tourists and noisy motorboats. Yet on the night of their arrival at Bingil Bay, they were shocked to learn that the army was about to seize a beautiful rain-covered mountain overlooking their house site in order to test toxic weapon systems. Though John was busy for the next few years building a superb new cyclone-proof homestead, one of the first in the country, and a garden overlooking the Coral Sea, he took up an offer in 1962 from his forester friends, Len Webb and Jeff Tracy, to teach him the principles of rainforest ecology so that he could fight the army. These two scientists were now running a small CSIRO rainforest centre in Brisbane and had come to see themselves as revolutionaries who needed to halt the destruction of Queensland's unique Gondwana-era rainforests by sugarcane farmers, cattle ranchers, urban developers, and now military warriors. Fortunately, his friends' potent ecology lessons unleashed in John Busst a passionate life mission to save Queensland's lowland rainforests, and goaded him also to ask his old friend Harry Holt, now Australia's Prime Minister, to help stop the army's devastations. Always quick to act, John created a bogus local Tropical Rainforest Preservation Committee consisting of two people, John, the President, and Alison, the Secretary. They then dispatched 50 letters to influential scientists, politicians, and forest officials, calling for an urgent scientific survey of these imperiled rainforests. John then persuaded the CSIRO to appoint Len Webb to undertake a pioneering survey to identify 20 potential rainforest preserves. And then while Len was away overseas, John succeeded on his own in getting half of these gazetted as national parks, and the other half followed soon after. In the process, though, John accrued definite evidence that the army was secretly using rare, endangered rainforest to test the toxic deforestation powers of Agent Orange for use by Australia and its allies in the Vietnam War. Some rich rainforest areas had already been obliterated, including one that threatened Innisfail's water supply, leading the locals to complain that they now lived in Agent Orange Town. Still, John's and Harry's persistent investigations eventually forced the army to cease both their defoliant testing and their reckless rainforest grabs. But on the 8th of August 1967, John and Alison learnt of a new threat. A young sugarcane entrepreneur had filed an application to dredge 84 acres of limestone from nearby Ellison Reef, which he claimed was dead and should therefore be turned into sugarcane fertiliser. Having lived for years opposite a fringing reef on Badara Island, John knew that coral reefs always contained both living and dead species. Yet when he attempted to get the scientific support to oppose this application, he was shocked to find that Queensland's marine geologists favoured what they called the controlled exploitation of barrier reef resources, including a future aspiration to mine it for oil and gas. John scornfully compared this to knocking down the Taj Mahal building in India in order to make road gravel. Worse still, the local mining warden refused any of John's arguments about mining the Ellison Reef because he was not a credentialed scientist. John did, however, manage to squeak an adjournment for another court hearing. Fortunately, John had just established a new Innisfail branch of the famed Brisbane poet Judith Wright's Wildlife Preservation Society, and she suggested to him to get help from a group of young marine scientists belonging to the Queensland Littoral Society. These were students, and they instantly agreed to undertake an underwater survey, provided that John organised and financed all the costs and the necessary logistics. This he did. And in November 1967, the students reported to the mining warden that Ellison Reef had contained 190 fish species, 80 coral species, and 60 mollusk species. And it remains a live reef to this day. I've dived on it 3 times. Incidentally, they had already brought bulldozers in and taken large chunks out of it. The mining warden thus had no choice, though, than to reject the application. Despite their success, the new year of 1968 brought both John Busst and Judith Wright a series of crippling setbacks. While Judith was away trying to find financial support overseas, John had to cope with the devastating shock of his friend Harry's recent drowning at Portsea, and then of the refusal of Harry's former political colleagues to take up John's idea of establishing a Great Barrier Reef National Park in honour of his late friend. Worse still, John discovered that Queensland's aggressive new Country Party Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, had secretly leased 80% of Australia's Italy-sized Great Barrier Reef to a batch of international oil companies and had then invested heavily and personally in the proposed outcome. Bjelke-Petersen had cunningly also negated all attempts by Australian scientists to have the Great Barrier Reef properly surveyed for the first time. Instead, he selected an American marine geologist called Dr. Alan Ladd to do the job. Ladd had abundant experience working for oil companies and oil drillers, but knew next to nothing about corals. He conducted his survey in less than 4 weeks, in which he flew with Bjelke-Petersen's officials over 2,300 kilometres of the Great Barrier Reef. And then he, of course, recommended that it should be used for mining, oil, gas, fertiliser and cement. Well, despite these pressures, John fought back, delightedly adopting the nickname of the Bingil Bay Bastard, coined by his army enemies. He also decided to replicate the kind of political support that Harry Holt had given him. So he collared 2 powerful federal government figures, Prime Minister John Gorton and opposition leader Gough Whitlam, while both of them were on their Barrier Reef holidays, poor folk. He got hold of Whitlam and talked to or at him for 4.5 hours. The Australian newspaper would later marvel at John's uncanny ability for influencing people in high places. But it was really the quality and originality of his research and knowledge that impressed these hard-nosed politicians. In particular, they valued John's exhaustive investigations to prove that it was the Commonwealth Government, rather than Queensland, that possessed legal sovereignty of the offshore resources of the continental shelf, and therefore of the Great Barrier Reef. In early October 1969, John's tireless drive led a young member of his branch, who was also a trade unionist, to ask him for some conservationist material to take to the forthcoming Congress of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. So John sat down and hand-wrote a 12-page submission. He argued that it was imperative to stop the Ampol JPEX oil companies, which had been invited by Joh Bjelke-Petersen to conduct offshore drilling tests at Repulse Bay near Mackay. It was also intended to trigger the full-scale oil mining of the reef. John's searing submission explained that oil and gas mining generated inevitably spills as a consequence of natural geological faults or mechanical errors or sheer human greed. And he pointed to the dramatic example of the explosion of oil leaks in California's Santa Barbara Channel, which were still gushing after 12 months of attempts to stop them. He therefore asked the unions to pass a series of resolutions. This included a request that they issue a writ to stop the Ampol JPEX oil companies from undertaking their drilling tests. At the same time, he learned that a young and brilliant young man in the trade union business was just going to be awarded to be secretary of the same organisation, and he was called Bob Hawke. So John contacted Judith Wright and asked her to write to Bob Hawke, and she wrote a 2.5-page letter to him and begged him to please read the documents that John Busst had given her, and please then take his documents and spread them through the different organisations of trade unions. He did so. And on the 6th of January, after it had passed, the John Bust's material had passed through a variety of Australian trades, he eventually came to the Australian Trades and Labour Council, who agreed in principle to what John had suggested, which was a black ban. And they ratified it 2 days later. John told Judith ecstatically, "It has taken 2.5 years to find the weapon. This is it. We will win." And so it proved. After consulting with the relevant union secretaries, the Senator George Georges formally instigated a total black ban on the Ampol JPEX oil drilling ship, the Navigator, which was still sailing in from Texas. This ban ultimately forced furious Joh Bjelke-Petersen into having to join a royal commission on the future of the Great Barrier Reef. And that Royal Commission, in turn, is what leading to the Barrier Reef Marine Park. Sadly, by early 1971, the incurable throat cancer that John Busst had been battling for 3 years prevented him from submitting his completed case material to the Royal Commission in person. Nevertheless, Judith Wright ensured that its content was heard. On the 5th of March 1971, John managed to croak a last speech to his local supporters, in which he explained new scientific information for how corals were generated, and we might talk about that later. And also, he predicted that the Great Barrier Reef was now certain to be saved. Exactly 1 month later, he died, aged 72, in the local Tully Hospital. Judith Wright would produce 2 selfless memorials of John's achievements. One in her classic book, The Coral Battleground, written in his honour, and one in her moving words that she provided for John's commemorative plaque overlooking Bingil Bay. It described John Busst perfectly as an artist and lover of beauty who fought that man and nature might survive. Well, confronted as we now are by the massive planetary threats of climate change, I believe that we desperately need to find a new swag of Bingil Bay Bastards to ensure that humans and nature do indeed survive. Thank you very much.
So lovely to see you all here, and I can see that you've been absolutely captivated, and not surprising. And those of you joining us by streaming, I hope you're enjoying this special occasion as well. Great historians paint in light and shade. They trace through the archives and they lay down layers of evidence, building up a picture here and there, finding the angle to pull you in on an incredible story. 2003, a book drops about a shady character, a quack, a charlatan, a friend of Casanova. A distinguished historian in his own right steps into the world of trade and becomes a master painter and storyteller, built upon already an extensive and acclaimed career. Iain McCalman set the direction for writing history in Australia from that moment. The first, he thought, a less than courageous move. It struck this young historian as an incredibly courageous move. Read every chapter, couldn't put it down. An incredible story, an eye for angle, a shady character, sometimes in light and sometimes there, sometimes not. Was he good? Was he not? Was he terrible? Was he great? The eye for the story. And so it was set that Iain McCalman, great historian, became the master painter of the profession. And a couple of decades later, you can see the evidence of his impact in the number of historians now that write both for trade and for university presses. And in fact, testimony to his impact is the number of historians that have won history prizes in this country and internationally through trade presses. You've demonstrated to us that it is great to be a great historian and a great storyteller. And Hayden White, the theoretician, always said, we tell great stories because we have an ethical purpose. We say what we think the world ought to be when we talk about the past. And you do that. So welcome, Iain. It's an incredible privilege for me to be sitting. And in fact, I coordinated my outfit with yours tonight. It was quite by accident, but I thought royal purple was the way to greet royalty in the profession. So thank you so much for your beautiful telling of the story. And I want to kick off and say he's such an interesting character. I didn't know anything about John Busst. I wasn't even sure whether I should call him John Busst or John Busst because he added the umlaut himself,
yes,
which is lovely. What a cheeky thing to do, really beautiful thing to do. And you find this extraordinary person. Over your career, you've written about a dodgy Count Cagliostro. You then start telling us about evidence and fact. You write a history of Newgate Prison. You then write this beautiful book on the Barrier Reef. And then you find this extraordinary story and start telling us. So I want to start off by looking at one of the characters that comes into view, Harry Holt. Harold Holt. There's a moment you're describing him skin diving in the ocean and you hold your breath. You say, get out of the water, mate. It's not going to go well. The way you describe him being a daredevil in the water, you hold your breath. How important is John Bust's relationship with Harold Holt to this story, this history that you've told?
Well, it's incredibly important. They went to the same school, Wesley College, and they went to the same school at the same time. I think that John Busst was a year younger, but from 10 they were together in that particular school. And they bonded tremendously closely. And I think that it was a particularly important relationship for Harry because he, unlike John Busst, did not have a stable background. His mother had died when he was very early, when he was very young, and his father just didn't give a damn for him. So he was a lonely and sad boy who I think managed to make the headmaster a kind of figure, father figure, and John Busst a brother figure. And these two boys connected and continued right through into university. It looked as though John Busst was going to be a lawyer, and then perhaps, go into politics like his friend. Instead, he drops out and becomes a bohemian artist. And so there you go. So they part, but not for long. And the moment, I think, where things change again is when Harold Holt marries Zara, which is in 1946, and they're invited by the Busts to come over to where they are on Badara Island and have a holiday. And they come over and they absolutely fall in love with far north Queensland, with its exotic, beautiful place, and its incredible sorts of plants, and its incredible flora and fauna, and even its wonderful way of life, in the Busst case, which was just lying around and occasionally collecting some fish. Anyway, the net result was that the Holts went every year to stay with them. And they had this, again, very, very bonded relationship. And as a result, the Holts became completely committed to, just as committed as John, to the rainforest and the reef. So it was no surprise, really, that when John finally decides he's going to have to tap his friend, who's now the Prime Minister, on the shoulder and say, "Listen, mate." Well, he used to call him Cock. Say, "Listen, Cock, what you got to do here is you've got to fix up the Barrier Reef, and and you know that these bastards from the army are blowing up the whole." So this is the kind of thing that, and it was almost inevitable that Harry responded and saved a number of John's perilous activities as a result. But I do think the one thing I would say about in protection of John, a wild man that he was, is that he was very conscious of not embarrassing his friend. He knew he had to, in a sense, hide the intensity of their relationship. And so what he tended to do was to use other kinds of front people, and he'd feed the information through so that nobody ever accused him of doing work for John. But he did, and up until his death, he had a major influence on John, and even after his death, actually.
It's quite extraordinary, and you do wonder from that really lifelong relationship. His ability, though, to connect with other politicians is really extraordinary. So not just Harry, but John Gorton and Gough Whitlam. Two very different characters. How does somebody go from having a lifelong friendship with Harry Holt to actually managing to get the attention, apart from 4.5 hours of talking with Gough Whitlam, how does he get their attention given that they were really very different characters?
They were, and you've got to remember that John Busst has no qualifications whatsoever, apart from his painting. So what he does, one of the things he did discover when he was sort of starting his, talks to Harry, is that you don't just go to people like that and ask them to do something for you. On the other, what you do is you go and give them something that's interesting, something that interests them. And then you start the conversation. And so what he did with both those two incredibly powerful figures is he caught them each of them while they were holidaying on the Barrier Reef, and they couldn't get away from him. And he then offered them some information that they did not know, that even their officials who were supposed to be looking at everything did not know. One of them was that Bjelke-Petersen has 80% of this barrier reef the size of Italy has been given away to become an oil mixture, That was one thing they had not heard of. And the other thing was this claim that was being made more and more by Bjelke-Petersen and others that reefs were dead, because they'd find some dead specimens and they'd say the reef was dead. And he pointed out that every reef has both dead and life parts to it. And that's part of the whole way in which reefs grow. And so those two pieces of information were really very revealing to both those people. And then the next thing, and I think the last thing he did that cemented their relationship, is he said, look, I'm going to give you information about this. I promise you I know what's going on. I'll give it to you. But I'm going to give it to both of them. They weren't together. He said, I'm going to give it to both of you two, because I know, you're not on the same side in politics, but this is too important. Saving the Barrier Reef is too important. We've got to stop big little bickering. And they really acknowledged that. And they kept that. They kept that relationship, which it seems almost unimaginable today, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, you just think about it and you think all the places you'd want to take John Busst, to the Coorong, to show him the Ediacaran fossil beds in Nilpena, the new fossil national park up in the Flinders, through the Samphire Flats on the York Peninsula, into the sugar gums around Barabara.
Yes.
As you read this and this evocation of place and how important it is to be in the place that you're in, and this beautiful Ghana country we're sitting in, you just think, to have that tie to a place is such a privilege, and to have that basis to bring people in via the beauty.
Yes.
And just the profoundness of that.
Yes.
I remember that word learning to hike in Tassie and just thinking over and over again, the places we are are such a privilege to be in the deep time we're in. So you can see why he might have had the opportunity to get their attention.
Yes.
Because you can write a paper, but to bring a person to a place and show them that beautiful place, they see it, it's right there in your hands. Exactly. I think he'd be excited by the spider crabs at the moment in Coffin Bay as well, to be honest with you. They're having a big gathering at the moment, lots of spider crabs, if you're into that. There's another PM that comes into view. This book is full of prime ministers.
Yes.
Right? It's really extraordinary. So let's come to the young Bob Hawke.
Bob Hawke, yeah. So it is interesting with Bob Hawke. It's a fascinating story, and really the enormous importance of Bob Hawke and saving the Great Barrier Reef has not been, I've never seen it discussed. But in effect, what I sort of touched on there was that John Busst had seen that this young bloke, Bob Hawke, is being made secretary of this important union, and this is an opportunity because this Bob Hawke is something special, and so he sits down and writes a 12-page piece, a description of what he wants to do and what he wants Bob Hawke to do, and he then sends it off with Judith Wright doing a little, tickling of Bob Hawke on the way. With a beautiful two-page thing describing for him why it's important to listen to what John Busst has said. And Hawke takes it up. And the first thing he does is he immediately takes the submission that John Busst called, this 12-page submission. It's amazing. He did it overnight. It's done in ink, pen. And he takes it first acknowledges it, that he agrees with it, and he agrees with one of its propositions, which is that you're going to have to use a black band. Anyway, he goes first to a union which has a number of people who work in the Barrier Reef, and who felt that their work was going to be completely obliterated once this area became oil and gas and oil, drilling and then spilling. And they were very nervous and anxious about it. And as a result of this, they decide that this particular union will back the idea of a black band. But then, again, the second thing that Bob Hawke does is that he knows you've got to go to the higher part of the union. This little other union is not going to catch the thing. So he actually goes to the union, which is called, I'm just trying to remember what the union is. Anyway, it is the union that looks after the entire notion of the way in which you operate in that world. And one of its important capacities was it was the only union which can instigate more than one black band, because they decided that there's going to have to be more than one black band used. And that the two union secretaries get together. Both of them are very powerful characters. They're also extremely opposed to Joh Bjelke-Petersen. And they agree that they will, in fact, put out a black band to stop this oil drilling testing that's going to take place around Mackay. And the whole idea of this with Bjelke-Petersen is once you do the test drilling, you immediately open up the whole of the area for oil drilling, and these drillers were all waiting. And so what they did was they decided to do it through a George Georges, who's a senator, yeah. And he sent a telegram over to the Ampol JPEX, which was the union that was, the oil company, which was sending out a big oil drilling boat, which was going to come and do the drilling. And they sends out this, and he says, if you come here, we will black ban you. We'll black ban your products, we'll black ban your food, everything else you will have to stop. And they give up. And the net result is that Bjelke-Petersen is absolutely furious. He's been stopped. He's incidentally put 500,000 contributions that were going to come back to him. So he has to actually then confront John Gorton, who said, we are going to have a Royal Commission into the future of the reef. And Bjelke-Petersen has to do that. And that Royal Commission would become the source of eventually the marine, the great marine creation that is today's Barrier Reef. What I would say then was that John Busst provided the ammunition, and it was Bob Hawke who pulled the trigger.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
That's how it happened.
It's a really novel insight, because I know that students in schools now are taught about the black bands, and the most familiar case would be the rocks in Sydney. People are very familiar with the protection of that You know, people walk through and take that for granted now, but to see Hawke at play, when you have the privilege of, you know, being associated with the Hawke Centre and you ask people about Hawke, you get so many different examples of things he's done. But this is just a lovely, lovely example of a story that I hadn't heard. And it's just great because we're familiar. When you think of Hawke, you think of so many things, often later in his career, and this is one, a contribution he makes.
It's a very, very major one. Very major one,
right?
For which he should be, you know, there's a story in a book in itself.
Oh, there you go. There's another book. We were saying before that historians, a bit like Heathrow, they've got one book that's just landed. There's one coming into land. There's another one off on the horizon. And then there's the dream one. Sometimes they crash. But there's always one on the horizon, isn't there? And you're always thinking about the next one. You're always thinking the next one's going to come, the next one's going to come. Now, we need to, it's interesting because you can read the book and you can read it as kind of an interesting political history of Australia at that time, which is really wonderful. But the risk of that is that you lose sight of Busst himself.
Yes.
And he's pivotal to the story. He's kind of, in a way, the glue in all of this, which is quite remarkable. So I'm really curious to know this person who's doing a law degree drops out, he becomes a bohemian artist, he's never painted before in his life. And then he ends up in Bandara Island. And I'm just really wondering, what's the connection between what he's doing in Melbourne and what he's doing in Queensland? I mean, is that a complete break in his life? Are they connected between? What's the connection for us?
It's a gradual process, I think. I mean, I've described how, in the book, just briefly how, you know, even at school, when the headmaster was very, very fond of going out into the bush and teaching the young kids about the importance and beauty of nature. So they were touched in this way. But I think that what really, the fundamental change that is gradually occurs in John Busst begins really when he goes and builds at Montsalvat. And then from Montsalvat, having really come close to being the greatest builder of Montsalvat, he then goes and builds this mud brick house, a glorious mud brick house, almost completely on his own, without power, without, you know, any fancy new tools. And in order to do that, and I did it myself. In 1970, I went and built a mud brick house without any power in the Beechworth area. And I found I had to really understand the earth and to find the right kind of work, the earth to build the bricks. I had to learn how to build those bricks. I had to go with rangers into the bush who would find for me the kind of tree to cut down that would keep the posts for the roof. And then I would have to dig a well, find the water, and I would also have to grow the food and adapt to the environment around Beechworth. And as a result of that, that's what trips me into becoming interested in environmental stuff and ending up, you know, running an environmental centre. It was that process, and it was that process in John Busst that begins him. He's already becoming somebody completely obsessed with the environment and how to use it and how to make sure it's not abused.
That's extraordinary. I didn't know that you'd built a mud brick house. It's kind of like, you know, you'd done the research for the book way back there, understood the labours of it.
It's a bit of a hippie story.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. But also Busst himself, you said he when you describe beautifully in the book, he creates furniture out of bamboo as well. Just
gorgeous.
Crafting
he builds
everything.
all his own furniture, everything. Even his paintings, all the paintings have used bamboo around the edges for the paintings. It's Amazing, yeah.
That's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Like, I think of all those young people watching YouTube videos on how to build things now, and I say, okay, that's great. It can go in a good direction. So it's really, I mean, one of the things you have as an obligation as an historian, when you focus in on something, you nurture the story around someone. And sometimes the people that you tell stories about are not very nice. They do terrible things. But in this case, this is a person that's acted way beyond himself and saved something for all of us. It's an extraordinary, when you read the story, you forget so easily how hard fought it was to protect the Barrier Reef. So, you know, I'm really, you read it and you're just overjoyed at the outcome, but you're also sad that John himself didn't see that outcome, and a bit sad that John himself has been a bit in the shadows on this. So why has he been so in those shadows? I mean, there's been a lot of respect paid for him by Judith Wright and other people around his contribution.
Yes, that's a very good question, actually. And it seemed a bit mysterious to me at first. I think what explains it is the timing, is that he died just before the decision was made. I mean, it had already been, as it were, put into place, but he died during the time of the Royal Commission. And the reef was technically saved quite close to when he died. And when he died, he did get a large number of people, like Judith Wright, write the book about him. There are people who wrote, journalists who wrote about him a lot. He did get recognition, but then he's dead. And for the next 4 years, they bicker. The politicians bicker about how they're actually going to set up the marine the marine story that they're going to do. How is it going to work? How is it going to be managed? And they fight and bicker about it. And Judith Wright notes at that time that the politicians lost all interest in the people who'd won the reef. From that, they're gone. They're gone. We've got the reef now. It's our job. One of those politicians was another prime minister that John had a little contents with. That was Malcolm Fraser.
Right.
And Malcolm Fraser was the minister. He was the minister for the army at the time when John was exposing the Agent Orange thing, and they went at hammer and tongs. And of course, John won, and Malcolm Fraser was not impressed. And I think he had a very great deal to do with those 4 years of how the reef was set up. And I think he's very happy for the bastard to Bingil Bay to be forgotten.
So we're going to go to John the artist, which is a really interesting side of the story. There's a lovely moment in the book where you talk about the colours that he uses. And you don't realise until you're reading that what a broad colour palette Australia has. Yes, so, growing up and looking at the paintings that Glover was trying to attempt to paint gum trees. The first people to settle Australia, they're painting European trees with green, deep greens. Glover's discovering, how sinuous gum trees are. We begin to lighten our tones of green and we wash out our green. Beautiful earth tones. And then suddenly here's this inscription, this laying down of light in very vivid colours, we're told.
Yes.
It's striking, really, to remember that Australia is a big place and that its colour palette is also big.
Absolutely.
So how does a painter in North Queensland talk to the colour palette of mainland Australia that might have gone for those earth tones? How did people respond to his painting?
Well, it's very difficult to find out, actually. Tracking his paintings is difficult because he didn't publish much of, he didn't publish much of his stuff. He sold it mainly to tourists, and they liked it and then they disappeared. They went away. And tracking his paintings is really hard. And he wasn't famous enough to get a large number of people assessing the work. But he did get there were some interesting journalists talking about his extremely strong colour. And he says in response, he said, look, my favourite artist is Gauguin, and he and I, he said, who have both been accused of having far too strong coloration in our work, the density of the sea, the red earth, all that. And he said, but it's exactly what the tropics is like. And he said these people who looked at my paintings all came from the south. They'd never been up to the north. They had no idea what the north was like. So that was the case he was making was really that he and Gauguin painted as they saw it, painted as they felt it. And as a matter of fact, I went to the great big Gauguin exhibition, which is on at Melbourne, on in Canberra, and do go to it. It's incredible. It's the biggest exhibition there's ever been on Gauguin. And at the end of that, I thought, John's right. John's right. This is a world. This is the world of the Pacific that's been created for us by this man. And it does seem incredibly colourful and exotic, because it is.
I mean, you sit in the rainforest and you see the flicker of the iridescence of a cassowary passing by, and the depth of the colour is there, and it catches you, doesn't it?
Yeah,
you have to remember how broad this place is. Now, we're kind of coming to the end of the conversation, but look, Sam Weinberg, the history educator, he says a great history always ends with a question mark.
Right.
Always. So the question mark is this: if John were around now, what would he rally for? What would his cause be now? Because in a way, the reef has been protected, but it's still very fragile. And would that be his concern now?
Absolutely. I actually think it's a really good question. I think that what John would do is go straight back to the things that he did before and try and rectify them now, because they've returned. The problem has returned, but in a completely new way and a much more dangerous way. I mean, just starting with the rainforest. I mean, rainforest is still being cut down and still being chopped up and so on. But not only that, it's extended to other kinds of timber. So what we're finding is deforestation going very rapidly, right through from your Tasmania, right through Queensland. All these different places are still chopping down natural timbers. And John would be furious about that, and furious also because the animals that live in them are becoming extinct. They're dying in large quantities. So that would have got him. But far worse is the problem with corals, coral reefs. I mean, it's not just getting rid of Joe Bjelke-Petersen now. What we have is all the corals of the world are under kind of a death wish, a possible death wish. And the reason for that is, as we know, it's a human generated thing in the sense that, using fossil fuels has created this enormous CO2 problem in the environment. And that in turn, has heated the water. And the water is now considerably hotter than it's been in John's time. And as a result, what we're now getting is this bleaching. And bleaching is a relatively new thing. It's post-John. Had never occurred before that. We've now had 5 mass bleachings in 8 years. The worst one is probably the one that's happening now. And I don't know if you understand how or why bleaching occurs, but when we discovered how corals are created, they're created because there's tiny little algae in the cells of the coral creature, and that tiny little algae, generates an energy that gives the coral the power to lay down limestone against the waves and so on. It gives it a huge jolt of energy. But unfortunately, when the water gets hot, those little algae swim out. So they no longer provide that extra drive. And what happens then is the corals starve and ultimately die. They can be renewed if there are long periods of time when there isn't this overheating occurring. But at the moment, it doesn't look as though we're going to see that for a long time. So, I think what John would know if he lived now is that we have to get to zero on greenhouse gases. Yeah. And if we don't do that, and if we don't do that soon, all the reefs in the world will die. 25% of all the food stock will die. And so I do feel that John would be actually embracing the fight as he embraced the fight back then. But it's a very different fight now. It's not Joe Bjelke-Petersen you have to worry about. We have to worry about this, a planetary problem.
People talk about the tragedy of the commons. The problem is so big.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how to solve it. And yet, it's interesting, I've met people that have created artificial reefs to protect the beautiful oysters, the native oysters in South Australian waters, the amazing marine biodiversity off Aldinga, Moana. It's not that far from where we are here. And I know people that are working, individual people, who've stood up against that tragedy of the commons and said, by doing this, I can do that.
Yes,
by writing this letter, I can do this. By catching the ear of a politician for 4.5 hours, I can do this. And by writing this history, I can do this.
It does. He gives us an example of an ordinary person. I mean, he is extraordinary in his energy and in his generosity of soul, really. Everybody liked him, whether you were a toff or whether you were a person without any education. Kids loved him. He never had any kids. He adored kids. So it's partly a personality and partly just this incredible drive, this little guy with an incredible drive. And you see what he can do. And I guess I find it inspirational to read about this person because he's not fancy pants. He's not someone who's had great education or, he's just you and me and, person around the corner.
So I want you to picture this. The book drops in your hands in 2003. You've never met the person before. You read their words and you think, wow, this is lightning.
Yeah.
This is lightning. Ian's name is known so much overseas. Everywhere I go, people say, do you know the great Iain McCalman? Well, he's got great in front of him like a pope.
The question you can be asked now is, do I know the great Iain? 77 years old, it's not the same.
Still rocking strong, don't you think? I think we should acknowledge that, don't you think? And my mum said, it's not how old you are, it's what you do that counts. It's right. What you do that counts, that it's incredible that you can talk to the planet by writing letters. You can talk to the planet by writing history books.
Yeah.
You can talk to the next generation about how they can create great history books. So if you look at the flourishing talent now in Australia, the regeneration of Australian history in words, Iain has played an incredible role in this.
But there is somebody who's doing something incredible about history and what AI, a new problem that we face, and that's the person sitting next to me. In fact, I don't think I've ever been interviewed by someone who was both partly a Vice-Chancellor, partly a Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and also as another a superstar as well.
I'm wearing the same colour as you tonight, mate. I'm good. I'm really good. I'm working on machine historians and how they write history versus humans. And what it gives you an insight into is when you read books by great historians, you realise just how phenomenal they are. Not just the crafting of the light of the story, the archival effort that goes into them, but the way they tug you into a place and remind you sometimes the world you're going into are very different to the one that you're on. So the count that you recounted, very different person. But sometimes they remind you how close things are to you, that it's within your reach to actually stand up and do something, to protect something around you that's so beautiful. So Iain, the power of the great historian is that question mark. And the question mark is not just, have I got all the evidence and might something new be discovered, like more evidence about Bust's art, could we find more evidence? But the question mark for all of us, which is when we read this and we finish this, what do we then do? What's next for us? So I want to actually thank you on behalf of the profession for putting the question mark in front of the book for all those young historians to come through, the way you've encouraged a shift towards writing history books for a much, much bigger audience and showing us that that's not incompatible with technical virtuosity. It's not an either or. It is fun, and we're going to come to that. You told me a little bit before you've got a current book on the boil that you're thinking about. Would you want to give us a sneak peek of what you're currently working on?
Well, I've got two things going. I'm just doing a little memoir. Actually, I was born and brought up in Africa, in Malawi, in the bush, anyway, I loved that place, and it was I spoke the indigenous language and everything. Anyway, I went back to Malawi in just the year after I was writing my PhD, and I had a wonderful time at one level recapturing the world that I had been involved in, but I also nearly got murdered by a brutal person who ran that country. And so it was a very difficult story that I was trying to tell. And so I've written a little memoir about that, which is now just I've done a version of it, and now I've got to start again. But it's been wonderful because I've recovered the language. I remember the language now, which I knew when I left Africa when I was how old was I? 18. Yeah. So so it was sort of implanted there. Anyway, that's a fun thing to do. I don't know whether other people will buy it, but my kids might grudgingly read it. That's a hope. Yeah,
that's a great sounding project, and there's always the next one that entices. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to talk to you tonight. It's been just lovely to connect with you in this way and to hear.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming. I want to thank you for that.